History was made here at exactly 2:43 this afternoon. The records were broken in the most spectacular way.
2003 saw Britain's weather go into overdrive.
They were the first to break the record at Heathrow's weather station, measuring 99, then 100 degrees Fahrenheit.
There was an almost palpable excitement about breaking the 100-degree Fahrenheit mark.
Up and down the country, we embraced the hot weather in typical British fashion.
I remember the pub down the road just flinging a couple of chairs outside. There's your alfresco dining, have it.
But the sweltering conditions saw much of the UK grind to a halt.
Soaring temperatures have made train travel even more of a trial than usual.
It turned our train network into a train network equivalent to the one in 1800s. I mean, trains were doing 60 mile an hour.
Why do I have to be on a train smashing glass with my bare hands to try and get people a breath of fresh air?
All of a sudden, it's not a blissful, long summer holiday. It's an Orwellian fiasco.
Long periods of dry weather caused chaos for farmers and fire crews.
Literally, it becomes a tinderbox.
A number of areas have only had 10% of their usual rainfall.
High temperatures, sun, dry, and then with the winds, it just becomes a force of nature.
And as Britain baked in the heat, water companies were forced into taking drastic action.
The excessive demand left water levels at some reservoirs critically low, so engineers took the decision to shut off supplies.
It was starting to get to a stage where it wasn't only an inconvenience, but this was really affecting people's lives.
All across Europe, intense heat led to thousands of excess deaths.
The cost of the disaster is still being counted in lives lost, homes destroyed, and businesses ruined.
This is the story of the heatwave of 2003. Back in 2003, pop sensation Girls Aloud released their very first album, and Arcilla shocked the nation when she announced live on air that she was quitting Blind Date after 18 years at the helm.
Cilla Black, oh, what a darling. Obviously, I was drawn to Cilla because, like myself, she was a natural ginger.
It was such an institution, Blind Date, in this country, that when she announced she was leaving, it was really sad.
It just happened. People were, you know, pearls were clutched across the UK in that moment, thanks to Cilla.
And it wasn't just Cilla who left us all stunned that year. Who could forget when Golden Balls himself, David Beckham, shocked the footballing world when he swapped Manchester for Madrid, leaving fans across the country hot under the collar.
In the city where this global phenomena is a local hero, they've already started counting the cost.
He really was one of the jewels in Manchester United's team, because let's not forget, he was a tremendous footballer, but also that Beckham brand was well underway.
It just seemed mercurial, and I loved it. Posh and Becks became a thing, and they were like a king and queen, weren't they? They were our people's king and queen. They got married, sat on thrones, which was tremendous.
But it turns out Sir Alex Ferguson thought that was getting in the way of football.
2003 was also a year marked by a series of remarkable weather events that have become seared into the country's collective memory.
I remember going into supermarkets at the time and seeing the fridge section almost empty of drinks.
And I can just remember the heat of that summer and my first car having to, you know, crank all the windows open and going down the M4 thinking I was something in my second-hand, probably 8-year-old Rover 200, loving life.
The thing was about that summer, the temperatures did begin to rise. You were relying on this hot sunshine to come back, and my goodness, did it come back.
I do remember having a few days in a caravan with a friend of mine in Norfolk. It sounds great on paper, but when it's very hot, it's like living in a baked bean tin next to a lavatory.
But 2003 was no ordinary heatwave. That summer saw temperatures climbing to new highs. Across Europe, it was the hottest summer for 500 years and impacted millions of lives, as well as the environment and the economy.
Experts say this weather could have a huge economic impact.
That year, even though Europe was burning and France was seeing record temperatures, 8-day-long stretches of over 40 degrees, there's still a sense of the other. I don't know why that is. that little stretch of water with a channel that we seem to think that the heat won't hop across and it won't affect us in the same way. But it did.
That summer, temperatures soared to a sweltering 38.5 degrees Celsius, with Britain measuring its hottest days since records began in 1875.
Today's new record is likely to stand for some time.
In January, less than 5 weeks after a typically chilly Christmas, a freak warm sector from the tropical Atlantic swept across the UK, and much of the country basked in unusually warm spring-like weather.
Parts of Scotland had temperatures to equal the highest they've ever been in January, up around 18.3 degrees, I think, up in the northeast.
I remember not wearing a coat much at the start of the year. Like, I had a nice coat. For once I had a nice coat, and I remember not wearing it. And it got sort of past April, I was thinking, this is odd.
I have a memory of doing a gig, and it was ludicrously hot in January. And in fact, I came out of the gig, and there was an ice cream van outside, and I remember what it was called. It was called Fill My Cone.
And whilst us Brits were cooling down with the Mr. Whippy, politics was also hot on the agenda. Tony Blair was leading a Labour government.
But the work now has to go on.
And Britain was riding the crest of a wave of optimism at the dawn of a new millennium. The country was being encouraged to spend, and interest rates were the lowest they'd been in over 50 years.
One reason why rates were cut to such historically low levels today was to boost manufacturing.
There was still optimism. People were quite happy, so things were better.
I remember it being quite a fun time. It was before having to pay to get into town in your cars and all that sort of thing. And I just remember we used to take the car out, park down the King's Road. It was great.
The country was doing well financially. Second term of Blair government, a lot of investment. It's just before the crash, of course. People seemed to be positive about what the future holds.
And that mood of optimism was matched by a prolonged period of dry weather. Between February and April 2003, rainfall in Britain was lower than it had been for almost half a century. Instead of winter coats and umbrellas, people were peeling off the layers.
Actually, what made it unusual was how dry it was. When we think of the UK, we think of kind of grey skies and a lot of drizzle, and that tends to be our constant. But actually in 2003, we didn't get as much rain as normal.
We did get some very warm weather even in January, and extremely sunny weather in March, and it just seemed to go on from there.
The summer for a lot of people was kind of starting in the end of the winter into the start of the spring. It was a really dry and really sunny start to the year for so many people across the UK.
That on the surface sounds like a good thing, but we don't sort of think about the other side of, well, if it's not raining, where are we going to get our water from? So the fact that it was so dry at the start of the year is actually part of the problem for later in the year in August, which was when the heat hit.
The lack of rain and drought-like conditions were a disaster for the country's agriculture.
Fruit growers say this is a bad year for traditional English apples.
So sometimes I think we're too focused on looking up and seeing the big shiny thing in the sky and getting happy, but not really taking in as much of the knock-on effect that that's going to have on us later on.
We used to get a lot of calls into the programme from people who were working in agriculture saying, this is a disaster for us. Because if there are periods without rain, that's going to affect our crops, that's going to affect you later on in the supermarket.
It actually cooks the apple under the skin. Our varieties are not really intended for these sort of high temperatures.
Prices have to go up because there will be a surge in demand for the less amount of stock that's available.
By April 2003, some parts of the country had recorded no rainfall for 42 days. And these arid conditions created the perfect storm for what was to come next.